Good afternoon. You're listening to Gambling with an Edge. Now here are your hosts, Bob Dancer and Richard Munchkin.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Gambling with an Edge. I'm Bob Dancer.
And I'm Richard Munchkin.
Richard and I have had more than a 10-year run on Gambling with an Edge, and when we quit almost 7 months ago, we said we might have some additional shows on an irregular basis. This is the first one of those. It's taken longer than I thought to get irregular. We received an email from attorney Bob Loeb that he had some legal issues with online casinos to discuss with our audience, and were we interested? The stupid question. Of course we're interested. A few years ago, we posed the conundrum of whether Bob Loeb was the Midwest Bob Nersessian or whether Bob Nersessian was the Las Vegas Bob Loeb. We never did figure it out, and it turns out it doesn't matter. Both attorneys are friends with each other and friends of the show. So Bob Loeb, welcome to Gambling with an Edge.
Great to be back.
All right. Before I start asking questions to Bob Loeb, Richard, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, yeah, just that I'm still trying to find my way with the Life is a Gamble podcast. I kind of don't really know what it is yet or what I'm doing. But when Bob Loeb contacted me about this, I was like, you know what? This is definitely a Gambling with an Edge episode. And so I was just really happy to be able to call Bob Dancer and say, hey, do you want to do this episode? And he, of course, said yes. And so here we are. And who knows how often these episodes will present themselves, but at least once in a while, we'll be back with a Gambling with an Edge episode, and I'm happy about that.
Good. Happy. Everybody happy. All right. So, Bob Loeb. Today, we're talking about legal issues with online casinos. What is this all about?
Okay. We're talking primarily sports betting, and as everybody knows, that the sports books have just sprouted up in almost every state, sometimes many different sports books. And we are in the stage where the law is not clearly written. It's kind of the wild, wild west. States have not, even when they're regulating, states have not really drawn up laws that regulate the rules of sports betting. Sometimes there should be statutes that are on the book that tell them what to do. Sometimes there are administrative rules that get promulgated and passed that are not quite as accessible, certainly to the general public, or in this case, gamblers. And one of the things that has grown out of that is that the rules and the terms and conditions that are posted on a website, the kind of thing, not just in gambling, where everybody, if they want to access their bank account or access a particular website, or in this case, a sports book, we all have blindly, I'm sure, checked the terms and conditions that we're agreeing to them without reading them. And even if we read them, it would be legal mumbo jumbo. And so many people are gambling without any knowledge of some of the consequences where I get calls from gamblers who have some issues. The sports books are not necessarily the area in which I have been most engaged in my practice, but I have had quite a number of very distressing calls where, in a nutshell, people's accounts have been suspended, and in some cases, their amounts have been seized, or the casino, the sports book, are refusing to give it back. And I'm talking up to $500,000 in actually several cases, which is quite distressing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now we're talking here about legal regulated sports books. And again, people ask me all the time, do casinos cheat? And my answer is, in the old days, they used to deal seconds and gaff the games. And the modern version of that is casinos just try to steal your money. And now they're doing this in sports books, right? They are now just sometimes locking up people's money and refusing to pay.
Absolutely. I would have used the words that casinos are legally licensed these days, I'm not sure that they're being regulated much. And a couple horror stories come from Native American casinos that have sports books now. And I have to comment that the regulators are the same casinos. The
Right.
judge,
The Indians
the
are
jury,
regulating themselves.
exactly. And we all know, I think, what happens when you get to regulate yourself.
And so what is happening? I mean, have you had any success getting money back for people?
I've had varied success. I've had failures as well. I have had a number of successes on relatively small amounts where the casino's refusing to return the balance that is in a person's account. And that's where we've gotten involved. It's a little bit difficult for me to get a handle on litigating it because everything is online. When you open up an account on a sports book, you don't really have a human teller taking bets. You don't have a human casino manager. You don't have any way of really being in touch with them other than on their comments page. So it becomes difficult. But let me start with one thing that I want to mention to a lot of people. This should be one of the few times where I really know what I'm doing and have a helpful suggestion. Don't keep more money in your account than you need to currently place your bets, because some people have run up really high balances. They have committed what the casinos feel is an improper act. They have suspended the entire account. In other words, again, I've had a few cases where people have had balances of $500,000. There might be only $15,000 or $20,000 that's really in dispute where the casinos think somebody did wrong, but the people are not getting their $500,000 back.
So what are the kind of excuses the casinos are using to do this?
Okay. I'm not the tech expert. Casinos have prohibited the use of certain apps, AI in sports betting. They have prohibited inside information, which is not necessarily paying off the refs like in the old days or paying a player to blow a game. But I think...
But LeBron is injured, but the news hasn't come out yet, so you're betting before the news comes out, that kind of thing?
Right. And they use the phrase information that is not at this point publicly available. But more, they really fear the apps and the algorithms that people have, people who are probably even more savvy than the people who make the lines and get an advantage that way and are betting huge and are really attacking the bottom line of the casinos. The other thing that is very, very common that I get the most complaints about, and this is one where we aren't necessarily dealing with huge money, is the rules, the terms and conditions are prohibiting multiple people on the same account, sharing of information. And they've gotten good at that. When we started out, basically a couple of years ago with online sports books, it was kind of every casino or every company like FanDuel or DraftKings or BetMGM or whatever. They all had their own terms and conditions, rules and regulations. But I've definitely seen a trend where they've been sharing information, and even some of the smaller companies have the most detailed terms and conditions that have so many esoteric rules and phraseology like, we can do this if we feel like it. In other words, in our sole discretion, we can shut down an account. We can forfeit the money in our sole discretion. And the only remedy that a player has in some of these things is something that often violates public policy, and that's a mandatory arbitration clause, which says you can't take us to court. You can only go to mandatory arbitration, and it can only go to the company that we regularly use and support. In other words, you're getting a biased hearing.
Wow.
Yeah.
And can you tell us who the worst offenders are?
I'm not entirely sure because my knowledge is only really from the phone calls that I get. I have read that FanDuel has gone to some skewed or lesser paying odds, particularly on correlated bets.
Oh, well, but yeah,
That they're free to do.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, like, are you getting more than one person where the same company is stealing their money?
I haven't gotten enough calls to say I've got a pattern, but they're all over the place. It's been a couple of Indian casinos that are not affiliated with, let's call them a tribal chain of Indian casinos. We're talking some discrete, well, they have one bricks and mortar casino and now they have their own sports book, and they've gotten really sophisticated with denying people the rights. But I've probably got a smattering of 8, 9, 10 more of or single complaints from the larger chains. So maybe these are random. Maybe we're very much in this infancy, as we say, the Wild West. I wish I could say, there's one single chain that is really terrible. I would let you know.
But it's everybody.
I would let your listeners know,
Yeah.
Now, is part of the problem just these gamblers are too good at picking winners, and so the casinos don't want their action?
Kind of similar to an AP at table games, in a bricks and mortar casino. Yes. You're too good. You can play any other game. Well, you can't bet sports in these cases,
Well, or you can, but you're limited to $10 a bet.
And absolutely. And we would have, yes, absolutely.
Which is fine. I mean, we all would look at that as the cost of doing business. It's when they start stealing your money that and the same thing happens in casinos, with advantage players. They just take their money and say, try to get it back.
Yeah.
And eventually, usually you do, but it becomes costly and a big hassle.
Let me give you a couple horror stories that are public at this point. Okay. First one started out in England. And it was a guy who got together a group, sports betting, and they were taking advantage of what I refer to as the bonus. Bet your first bet and we're going to give you $150 or things like that. And there were some people who they found out that a single person got together a group of 15 or 20 people, and nobody was betting much more than the bonuses, but the 15 or 20 people were not really placing those bets. They weren't doing the gambling. It was just this one leader. And it's not unlike something that we've seen for several years now on slot pay and people who build up a large loss on a single day, but they're getting coupons for 10 days per month in the future. And they've got individuals who do their redeeming because they can't be there every day to do the redeeming. So the casinos are very much resisting when a single person is, at the very least, calling the shots or using the identification and the phone and the credit card of other people. And in some cases, the casinos are seeing the same pattern of bets, and they're cracking down on it. And they're saying, you have violated all of our terms and conditions. One other trap, and believe me, I'm not the techie who can explain this well, but a VPN is kind of similar to blocking caller ID, where somebody is hiding the URL from which they are placing bets.
Yeah, it can make you appear to be in another country or another state.
Correct. Or you're hiding that fact. Now, most states, when they are licensing online sportsbooks or online gambling, they are legally restricted to either residents of their state placing the bets or being physically present in the state when placing the bets. Okay? But some APs, when they feel that they've got a particularly strong advantage on some particular games, are placing bets from one location in 5 or 10 or 15 different states. Violates the terms of the conditions. The casinos or the casino industry has gradually obtained the technological capability of tracking bets and are not only turning down bets that come from other states because their license says they have to turn down those bets, but when somebody has attempted and they can show to their own satisfaction that winning bets have been placed from several states, they are disallowing those bets. And in a way, we could live with that, but they're freezing the accounts and taking the money. And we can't live with that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you found some way to get around their geolocation software, which they have, fine. But if you call your brother who lives in that state and he gets on his account and makes the bet, they shouldn't be able to, freeze his account.
No.
Just because you made the same bet in another state.
That's true. Their technology is also showing them when they're getting, in effect, the same bets on the same games in the same combinations, I guess you would call them, such that they think they are finding out that this is a group of people who are using the same information.
Well, but sure, that's true. There are groups that do that bet in multiple states, but I mean, how can there be anything wrong with that?
Well, just a minute. They're saying if a group of 10 in the same state are placing the same 6 bets on the same day, on the same teams, in the same games, and nothing more, that's a pattern that they are uncovering and presuming that that is wrongful collusion according to their terms and conditions. Under the laws of a few states, not most, Illinois is one, there's something called syndicated gambling, where they would interpret that as there's kind of like a single bookie or single bettor taking advantage of a particular line. In other words, Richard, you referred when bets come from several states, that's not so terrible. But if there's this collusion based on inside information and all the bets are coming from the same state, that would not be as serious. The casinos are treating it as just as serious. And I do think, we're in the infancy of AI. I think that is what's driving the casinos, because they think that somebody who's very adept at using AI will come up with better information in the aggregate, even if it's not inside information.
Well, sure. They do. They don't even before AI. I mean, the sharp sports bettors were sharper than the sports books.
Right.
So, yeah, that's just the way of the world.
Now, let me give you one other kind of thought. Common law fraud, long before we even had gambling in the United States. One of the definitions of common law fraud that applies in most state laws is if you make a false statement in order to obtain something that isn't yours, that's fraud. Classic example is if you inflate your income on a mortgage application to show that you really qualify for a particular mortgage, that's fraud. Okay. And as the law has developed in the United States, and I'm going to give you an example that many people have heard about, even if you make good on the false statement, in other words, the casino, the sports bettor, or the mortgage company, even if you make good on your payments on the mortgage, and let's say, again, the casino is not harmed thereby, the fact that you made the false statement can be fraud. The example that's in the news these days, I'm going to mention it.
It's in New York.
Is in New York, Donald Trump's case in New York State Court, where he made very serious false statements to Deutsche Bank. The government does not have to prove that they were harmed by the false statements. The fact that he made them is fraud. Okay? Now,
how does this relate to sports books? What is...
When a redeemer on slot play or a group of people, if one person is using 7 phones with the numbers that are registered to 7 different people, but they find that it's all out of one location and they get some more information such that they have at least somewhat provable belief that one person is using 7 identities, perhaps to get these bonuses or whatever. A false statement doesn't have to be a verbal statement. It can be an act. And when you put somebody else's player's card in the machine with another name, that is a false statement. And when you register for an online account in somebody else's name, real person or not, you're making a false statement that you are that person. And that violates their terms and conditions. And that has served to freeze a few accounts and one huge one that I'm aware of. Okay.
So if you guys are living in a dorm, everybody go to a different Starbucks to make your bets.
Well, it's interesting. The other public case that has gotten a fair amount of attention in the country is a case out of Iowa. Now, it happens that this has gotten not only a lot of publicity, but it came to the authorities' attention, was a college dorm that a few college athletes were living in, and a few games or a lot of bets were placed on games in which those athletes were participating. Okay. That's more of, the classic kind of fixing a game that we've known about for 100 years. Okay. But Iowa brought charges against the leader for some serious money fraud, against the athletes, and then the NCAA got involved, and some other bettors, all who were involved in the same scheme. And so, if you're in touch with athletes and they're placing bets for you, let that be a warning. The more common warning, I think, is huge bettors have a bullseye on their back. That's where they pay attention. Okay. That's where these $500,000 accounts came from. For those of you who are in a group, there's actually 2 groups that I'm aware of in which there was kind of a loser bettor, but a real big bettor who got affiliated with the sharp bettors. And because the loser bettor had a long record of losing, the casino was more eager to take his action. Okay. And so the big guys put their action into the name of the big loser bettor. And the casinos or the sports book got wise to what was going on. One of the legal problems was that this big loser was a wealthy, licensed professional. Now, if I or another lawyer wanted to bring a lawsuit, it would have to be in the name of the account holder who put the money up and placed the bets. In one case, a licensed professional was risking much more than his gambling losses. He was losing or potentially losing his livelihood because he would lose his license if it was publicly known that he was involved in this kind of betting.
He would lose his license for betting at a legal sports book?
For using other people's names, which under a lot of money laundering statutes is a violation. We're talking doctors, lawyers, stockbrokers licensed by the SEC, professionals who are...
Yeah, but they would have... But he wasn't using other people's names. Somebody was using his name to make the bets, right?
Well, at times, they were giving money to the licensed professional to place the bets.
I see. Yeah.
Because he could put down bigger money.
Yeah.
Okay. And so this guy declined to be a complainant, and all of the other people were without a remedy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had another real funny phone call. It was funny because it came from the general manager of an East Coast sports book, and he showed the knowledge, so I believed him that he was such. He was in the middle of a divorce. Wife had custody. 16-year-old son got a hold of wife's credit card. 16-year-old son started sports betting online in his mother's name.
Oh, boy.
Losing a lot of money, pissing off the father, okay? And the father kept kind of insisting with me that I can write the somewhat usual demand letter that I've had some success with, saying, you've abused this, you've gone too far, you had no right to keep all of his money, okay? And I should send the demand letter to... The gambling wasn't being done at the sports book that was being run by Dad, okay? That my demand letter will have the effect of scaring the sports book into thinking that their license could be in jeopardy for accepting an underage regular bettor, okay? And I sympathized with him in a way, but I had to decline, and this applies to everybody who's using an underage kid in a college dorm, often qualifies. You may be without a remedy, because for you to maintain your complaint to get all this money back means the lawyer has to elicit from the underage guy, his client, a confession to a crime. And I wasn't going to put a client in that position.
Yeah, if the underage kid had used his own name and ID, then you got, it seems you have a case. But,
then, yes, because the casino would be on notice of the proper age.
Yeah.
Yes. But I think in the Iowa case, they were even using the idea of somebody who's 21 and, you can figure out the rest. And I know that, some of these are rather unique factual situations and won't apply to most listeners. But the abuse by the casino, they'll continue to do this in more factual situations if they continue to get away with it, particularly where their terms and conditions are so restrictive, where anybody using a fake ID could be subject to this. I mean, it could get really out of hand. And so...
Well, let's go to what can be done. I mean, you mentioned don't let your balance get too
and I want to close. And I want to close on that note. Maybe that's my recommendation. Okay. All right. Anybody can always supplement their account, with more capital if they've been losing and need to. Okay.
Although there is a problem with banks who do not like you making transfers back and forth to casinos, and many people have had their bank accounts shut down too. So that is a problem, but not as big a problem as having your money stolen.
Exactly.
But I have a couple of ideas or suggestions as well, and those are, I think there are two things that are greatly underutilized, and those are the press and your representatives. So one idea would be to get a sports writer who likes to gamble involved in all this stuff and let him start writing articles about the stuff these places are doing.
That is a great suggestion. And in a similar vein,
attention that you can get for this stuff, the more they will have to stop it.
And in a similar vein, this is actually out of a bricks and mortar casino several years ago. We succeeded in getting money back by merely threatening to put up billboards criticized on the roads leading to the casino.
That's a great idea.
Cheating.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
It's like the press. It's a public airing of what they've done.
Well, the other thing that has been successful is, politicians are very cheap to buy. You make a $2,600 contribution to a guy's campaign, and literally you can get his home cell phone number. And in a case back, God, it's probably been 40 years, Tommy Highland, they made some donations to a guy and, explained to him what the casinos were doing to blackjack players. And he's like, that can't be true, right? And they took him to the casinos in Atlantic City and got him barred for being a card counter. And that's really why those laws got passed that you're not allowed to bar card counters in Atlantic City. So I'm sure there are a lot of politicians that like to bet on football. And you get some of them involved, get them backed off, from sports books where they're only allowed to bet $1.57 or whatever, which, literally some people are limited to these minuscule amounts. And, good things can happen,
Absolutely. And actually that touches, I'm glad you mentioned Tommy. With the exception of Tommy and James Grosjean, I can't tell you the number of times people have called me with a beef about what's happened to them in a casino, APs, okay?
Yeah.
And we go through the whole process, and here's what it will involve, and they don't want to publicly out themselves.
Yeah, I think it's a big mistake. I mean, look at Tommy and James Grosjean, two of the most well-known APs, and they still can play all the hours they want to play.
I couldn't agree with you more. I had a case ready to go where I happened to know that there were commissioners on the Missouri Gaming Board who would have been receptive to outlawing prep shuffles, and the casinos were engaging in it. Okay? And keep in mind, Missouri was one of the places where you couldn't bar people. And I had 4 or 5 people not willing to, each being a victim of that, not willing to be the plaintiff, not willing to even be a witness that it was done to them. And it's very frustrating. But the moral of all this is don't put yourself in the position of being a victim of one of these, so that you don't have to hire a lawyer, you don't have to fight with the casino. And again, I'm getting back to, take profits when you can, despite the banks. So,
is there amount of money that is too small to worry about? Like, if you have $10,000 in an account, is it all right to let it sit there, or is that?
Well, if you're placing $11 bets to make $10, 10,000 is probably on the high side. But the issue that you're raising, Bob, is really very similar to what's the choke point of any given casino? And it varies among casinos.
Okay. But presumably you are optimistic that you will get back this $500,000 from this sports bettor who was, say, pushing the envelope and the casino didn't like it. Is that a fair assessment?
I've had three or four that were particularly large amounts. Utterly failed in one. One is pending with the most modern of terms and conditions that give you no rights at all. And I'm not so optimistic. There is one other doctrine of law that I like a lot to use in this kind of area. It's called the doctrine of unjust enrichment. And I would apply it in the way so as to say, a casino, okay, you get to keep the hypothetical, well, let me not even do hypothetical. You keep the relatively small amount that you feel was improper, but you're not entitled to the balance that's in the account. That would be totally unfair, even though your rules and terms and conditions say you can. And if we wanted, and we can't sue in a regular court, we'd have to go to your friendly arbitrator. I've got no reason to be optimistic in those cases. And in the aggregate on those cases, most of which involve smaller amounts, the client and I kind of come to the conclusion that when we weigh risk and reward on a relatively small amount, the attorney's fees, and I'm not charging huge fees, eat up too much to where the risk is greater than the potential reward. In other words, well, it's kind of this way in the entire legal system. Nobody can bring a lawsuit for less than $30,000 or $40,000 these days because the outcome is always somewhat questionable, and the attorney's fees are going to be $10,000 to $15,000, and that's just not worth it. In other words, a huge portion of the population is shut out of access to the legal system.
Yeah. Well, a guy who can afford $500,000 in one account at one place can probably afford some billboards. So maybe.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, Bob. I want to thank you for doing this, Bob and Bob, both. So
good. And as a listener, I hope some more people come to you and you do more Gambling with an Edge shows.
Well, we are open to that possibility.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you, Bob. Now, at the end of our show, Richard and I used to have a recommended section where we would recommend something to our listeners. So, Richard, do you have a recommended for our audience today?
Of course I do. And it's very apropos of this particular episode. I just last night started watching a show on HBO Max called Bookie. And it is about a guy who is a bookie in LA. And I mean, he's kind of a throwback to the 1980s or something, because modern day private bookies all use a website. You can just rent a website where people can, it has all the software to make your bets on. But no, this guy still carries around a notepad and a pencil and writes down the bets, and people call him on the phone. And the show is a comedy, and its creator is Chuck Lorre, who's the guy who did 2.5 Men and
Big Bang Theory.
And Big Bang Theory, yes. And many other shows. And
right.
Surprisingly, he had this horrendous falling out with Charlie Sheen over 2.5 Men. And Charlie Sheen is in this series. And, at the end of 2.5 Men, he dropped a piano on Charlie Sheen. Like it was a body double dressed like Charlie Sheen. But, he had some really terrible things to say, but apparently they patched that up. And Charlie Sheen is not the star of the show, but he just shows up as himself, as a guy who owes the bookie money. So anyway, the show is pretty funny. And if you're into sports betting, obviously, you're probably already watching the show anyway, but definitely give it a watch.
My recommended is a new novel by Mitch Albom, Albom, called The Little Liar. It is basically a love story that begins in the Jewish quarter of Greece prior to World War II, where the Nazis eventually come in and gather up all the Jews, and there's Auschwitz involved, and it's pretty horrible what they describe. So I had read other descriptions of the Holocaust, and this one is opened my eyes to certain things. It is a love story, and it's well worth reading.
Bob Loeb, have you?
I'm going to stick with what I said. My recommendation: take profits out of your account when you can. You'll avoid a lot of trouble.
We'll avoid having to hire you.
Yes.
So that sounds good for the listener, not so good for your bankroll, but
Hey,
I think you'll survive.
that's not where I make my living, and I've said this for years. I'm so thrilled to be part of the AP community, and all of whom taught me how to be an AP, that I like to give back to the community when I can. So kind of a repository for some of the horror stories that I can relate to others.
And the AP community is glad to have you as part of it. So thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. Go out and hit lots of royal flushes, everybody. Good day.